As I mentioned earlier on, our focus tonight is on the healthcare system and, of course, psychoactive drugs, which is what Dr. Dolan is going to be presenting on. And just before the webinar, Dr. Dolan and I were discussing, and I just mentioned that I have been invited to speak at a cancer treatment center right here in Tulsa. And they believe in a multidisciplinary approach to health and wellness, the spiritual, the emotional approach, as well as the medical, be it radiation or surgery or chemotherapy. And the couple that was there, the lady was the one who had cancer, and they had left a very well-known cancer treatment center in this country because the doctors there did not believe in nutrition. Now, folks, if you have cancer and you're dealing with you're dealing with a very difficult healthcare problem, it would behoove you to go to a doctor that you can ask questions from, and you feel comfortable that he will also believe in other aspects in addition to his treatment, because there is a lot to be said for nutritional supplementation along with cancer, especially cancer. You just can't survive the ravages of cancer treatment, especially without a good, strong nutritional support backing you. And so that is very, very important, and that's why we try to bring balance in all of our talks and presentations. And the right person to bring balance when it comes to medication and the healthcare system is, of course, Dr. Moira Dolan. And I'm just going to ask Sherry to read her bill before we hand things over to her. Are you there? Sherry, if you...
Oh, there you are. Okay. Yes, I'm here. I couldn't be there for a minute. Okay. The joys of technology, right? Okay.
Right.
Okay, I'm actually going under an underpass, so hopefully I will not get muted here. Okay, I would love to introduce Moira to you. Okay, Dr. Moira Dolan is a board-certified internal medicine physician. She's the executive director of the Medical Accountability Network, an educational resource dedicated to establishing integrity in medicine. Dr. Dolan addresses the responsibility of participants in all aspects of taking responsibility for their own medical issues. Dr. Dolan is serving as the medical consultant for the state of Texas and the Office of Texas Inspector General. She's the editor of the subscription website, MedInfo, which defines a new role for patients in their own taking responsibility for their own health care decisions. Dr. Dolan's presentations are in language that the layperson can understand, and she uses lots of real-life examples so that she can communicate to everyone. All of her presentations are very educational, and she really does empower people to take control for their own health. So we are very grateful that she is with us tonight. Dr. Dolan, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much, Sherry, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you very much for having me back, Dr. David.
Oh, absolutely.
You're so right that this presentation fits right in with what you're doing there at the Building Strength webinars. So I'll just go ahead. We're talking about psychoactive drug effects and public safety, and I think this should be of interest to everyone. As Sherry mentioned, I am with Medical Accountability Network, and we feel that really informed consent is the keystone to an ethical physician-patient relationship. First, I'm going to start off with a definition. Psychotropic means affecting the mind or mood or other mental processes. So anything that affects the mind, the mood, behavior, feelings, perception, or emotion can really qualify as a psychotropic drug, whether it is intended to have those effects or not. It would qualify as that. Now let's take a look at the history of drugs that are intended to affect the mind, mood, emotion, and behavior. Back in the 1880s, cocaine was used as the first modern psychiatric drug, and here you see a vintage ad for Coca-Cola that at that time actually contained cocaine. Of course, it relieves exhaustion, I'll bet. It was actually prescribed as a drug by Sigmund Freud to his patients. And
Really?
and all the evidence suggests that Freud himself, from his memoirs, looks like he was actually addicted to cocaine. Now, in the early 1900s, barbiturates were used as sedatives. They were actually first discovered back in the century before that, in the mid-1800s. But they were put on the shelf as something that they weren't sure what its therapeutic action was. They basically combined malonic acid, which came from apples, with urea, which is something that's found in human urine. Now, why they were combining these things, who knows? But that actually caused the synthesis of the first barbiturate. It was thought to have no therapeutic value and was kept on the shelf. In the 1900s, it was manipulated by substituting some of the molecules, and then, as was the habit in those days, the chemist actually tasted it to help define its characteristics. Well, it put the chemist to sleep, and thus a sedative was born. Now, moving along here on the development of various psychiatric drugs, Merck, and this is the Merck headquarters back in Austria in the early 1900s, a molecule known as MDMA was invented. This was actually used initially as an insecticide because it was found to irritate and sometimes paralyze the nervous system. But it also was found to have some stimulant properties, and it was actually tried on soldiers in World War I to treat battle fatigue, and it was even used in pilots so they could stay awake longer. It was used experimentally. This drug, MDMA, would later come to be known as ecstasy. Of course, it was many years later, in the 1970s, that Dr. Alexander Shulgin, who was a former research scientist with Dow Chemical, he had personally experimented with ecstasy on himself, and he became a strong advocate for its psychiatric and its recreational use. In fact, he really was single-handedly responsible for popularizing the use of ecstasy among psychiatrists, and indeed it was a therapeutic psychiatric option that was prescribed for a short period of time. Of course, its recreational use is what we're all familiar with. By 1985, this was placed on Schedule I by the Drug Enforcement Administration, which means it has no therapeutic use. However, it's still available to research psychiatrists.
Dr. Dolan?
Yes.
What slide are you looking at right now?
I'm on the amphetamine slide.
We are looking at the ecstasy offered to psychiatry. Okay. Now we're seeing ecstasy goes public with the dance floor. Is that what you're referring to? Okay.
No, now let's see. I have moved on to the amphetamine slide. Okay, I'm on the ecstasy slide. I saw a picture with the lady in the kitchen just a minute ago. This one. Yes.
Okay. It seems like we are a little slower. The system is a little slow tonight. So if you would bear that in mind,
we'll take
a little while to catch up.
Well, in the 1930s, amphetamines were being used therapeutically as antidepressants, but also as performance enhancers for athletes and as stay-awake drugs for truck drivers. And here you see a vintage ad that appeared in a medical journal. At that time, the only advertising was in medical journals rather than to the lay public. And I don't know if you could read the small print, but it says, "Why is this woman tired?" And it says, well, she's tired for one of two reasons. Either she's got too much work to do, hello, look at those dishes, or she has a mental illness and she needs to be taking amphetamines as sort of a pep-up drug. So, we see amphetamines being widely used in that era. Now, in 1942, the phenothiazine drugs were synthesized. These paralyze the nervous system, and that's why the alternate name for this class of drugs is the so-called neuroleptic drugs, and that's a word that means nerve seizing. Again, like MDMA, these drugs were initially widely used as insecticides because of how they paralyze the nervous system. And in fact, today they're still used as anti-malarials in India, for instance, or if you travel to India, you'll be asked to take one of these medications. We'll talk later about how some of these drugs are also used to treat gastrointestinal disorders. Again, the alternate name is nerve seizing. Now, these were given initially to only the most severely affected schizophrenic, paranoid, institutionalized patients. And here you see an ad for stelazine, which is one of the drugs from this class, again from a medical journal. And it's a quote here supposedly from a paranoid patient. They come around 3 or 4 times a day and try to poison me. Well, I mean, yes, it's a nerve-seizing agent that is poisonous. But this was supposed to characterize the type of patient that would be appropriate for this drug. What these essentially were chemical straitjackets. Now, the use of them extended to anybody who you really wanted to get them to be still or quiet. And here you see an ad also from a medical journal for prompt control of senile agitation. So, you know, if Grandpa's getting too rambunctious there, why just throw some Thorazine his way and he'll calm right down. Now, the second generation of these drugs, second and third generations of these drugs now carry a black box warning specifically against their use in the elderly because they cause up to twice the death rate, especially from stroke. And yet here you see the ads starting back in the 1950s. This drug that's advertised here, Thorazine, was approved in 1954. Here's another ad for stelazine, and we see the use of this broadening, no longer for institutionalized schizophrenic patients or irascible elderly, but now even for people who excessively use the telephone. Well, if any of you have cell phones or Bluetooths or whatever you have, we would probably all fit in this category these days. And this was to allay chronic neurotic anxiety, but this is, again, a major tranquilizer in the phenothiazine class. And we'll talk about some of its side effects a little bit further on. Then we come into the 1960s, the era of Valium and Librium. These are from the benzodiazepine class. And this is an ad from Roche for what they thought would be the appropriate use of Valium. And here you see different pictures from the photo catalog of Jan, poor Jan. You see her with her dad, with a boyfriend, with her dad, with a boyfriend, with dad again. And then finally in 1970, Jan, all alone in a dorky-looking coat with a silly hairdo on a cruise. Basically, 35 and single. She needs Valium. And this was the advertising back then. Then we come up to the 1960s, but backing up just a little bit, LSD was actually developed in 1938. It was synthesized by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland. Its trade name, as you can see here, was Delicid. And it was used in mind control experiments by the military, and it was also prescribed as a psychiatric drug. This is an excerpt from the Delicid package insert from 1964. As you can see, Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. It had 3 different indications, and I've highlighted the second indication here. They were recommending that psychiatrists actually experiment with LSD themselves in order to, quote, gain an insight into the world and ideas, world and sensations of mental patients. In other words, they knew full well that this drug caused psychosis, caused mental illness. And here you see right on the package insert, they're advising the psychiatrist to take Delicid himself so that he himself can experience what his mental patients are experiencing. In the 1960s, of course, its social use was promoted by Timothy Leary, but by 1967, LSD was banned. Just like ecstasy in 1985, LSD got a Schedule I rating, which means that it's not generally available for prescription, but believe it or not, it's still available to research psychiatrists. That's not a real comforting thought. Then we move into the era of serotonin. And the reason we moved into this era is because, among many other things, it was found that one of the main brain chemicals that LSD affected was this chemical serotonin, which is simply a messenger molecule between neurons in the brain. And it somehow affected the serotonin receptors. So this led to the study and ultimately the creation of other designer chemicals that somehow affected serotonin. The hope was with some sort of more controllable outcome than what was seen with LSD, which was completely a wild card. And so you have drugs like Deserel and Wellbutrin, and then Prozac, Paxil, Surzone, Zoloft, all these serotonin-like drugs. Just as an... Go ahead.
Wasn't Prozac one of the most, if not the most widely sold drug at one time?
Yes, it was. It was a bestseller. It was one of the top 10 at one time. And then the drugs kept coming. You've got, once they started dabbling into serotonin, they said, well, what about other brain chemicals such as norepinephrine? Whereas the phenothiazine drugs that we discussed earlier from the 1940s and 50s were mostly affecting dopamine. You saw the Prozac, Paxil-like drugs mostly affecting serotonin, and then Effexor and other drugs starting to affect serotonin as well as norepinephrine. And then in the 1990s, we had the so-called second-generation neuroleptics. Now, these were actually given a marketing name of atypical antipsychotics. And the reason they were given that name is they were trying to distance themselves from the first-generation neuroleptic drugs, which had such horrific side effects, including causing psychosis, hallucination, personality changes, and also Parkinson's-like movement disorders. So this new generation was called atypical. Well, once we got experience with them, we found out that they cause exactly the same side effects as the first-generation drugs, so it was just a marketing term to try to call them atypical. So we can see here in the timeline, in the early 1900s, there was one or two drugs, and then there was a few more throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And when you really see the takeoff in the development of psychiatric drugs was in the 1960s, and it was really LSD that sparked all of that brain chemical research. And now we look at the cumulative number of psychiatric drugs, and it's around 110 that are available on the market now.
Wow.
So let's take a look at these drugs in a way that is a little bit different from how you may be used to looking at them. Let's take a look at drugs that mainly affect serotonin. LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin are in the exact same category as Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Lexapro, Luvox, and Remeron. So these drugs are mainly affecting the serotonin messenger system. The drugs that mainly affect dopamine are heroin and all of the so-called antipsychotic drugs, or like I said, more appropriately called the neuroleptic drugs, and it doesn't matter if they're first, second, or third generation. The newer ones that, there's a couple newer ones that aren't shown on this slide. Oh, I've got Geodon on there. Okay, I thought I didn't have Geodon on there. You could see here from, again, the Bayer company, a bottle of heroin. Heroin was actually prescribed at one time as a cough remedy. So let's just want to remind you, we're just practicing. Okay, drugs that mainly affect a neurotransmitter called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, just another brain chemical messenger. But this is a messenger that particularly is active as a sedative. And so you see here all of the sleeping pills, the Valium, Xanax, Ativan type of benzodiazepine pills, and then the more recent newcomers to the market, sleeping pills, Ambien, Lunesta, Sonata. And the reason I have that slide there of no diving or jumping from bridge is because these drugs all carry warnings regarding unusual behavior during a sleep-like state, such as sleep eating, sleep gambling, sleep driving, sleepwalking, sleep jumping out of a window, that type of thing.
So do these drugs raise kind of like raise the level of GABA in the brain?
I don't know that they raise the level, but they certainly activate the GABA neurotransmitters.
Okay. And
So sometimes it's actually a raised level, but more times than not it's an activation of a receptor or a blocking of a reuptake of the chemical so that it stays in the space in between the two nerves and continues to be active longer rather than an actual increase in the level. And that's the whole trick about these drugs, is that there's no doctor who is sticking a syringe in your head and finding out exactly what is the brain level of your serotonin or GABA or dopamine. But we do know that although most of these psychiatric drugs affect multiple neurotransmitter systems, I've got them classified in this way according to what they mostly affect or their most profound effect. But then we do have a whole category of drugs that affect so many different neurotransmitters that they just cannot otherwise be categorized. And here we have the drugs that are associated more with the speed type effect. Cocaine is in the exact same category as ecstasy and all of the amphetamines, including Ritalin. I came across a very interesting piece of information just a couple days ago. I was looking on the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration website about amphetamines, and they have a statement on there that says experienced users cannot tell the difference between taking prescription Adderall, Dexedrine, Ritalin, Metadate, Concerta, and street meth. So no matter what these are named or whether you get them through a prescription pad or from the corner dealer, an amphetamine is an amphetamine. Ritalin actually responds to the amphetamine receptors in the brain with 5 times the affinity of cocaine.
Oh my goodness!
Yes.
Is this well known?
Yeah, this is information you can look up anywhere. Now there are even more drugs that affect multiple neurotransmitters that, like I said, can't otherwise be characterized. A couple of the ones you see toward the bottom of the slide there, Effexor and Strattera, are very interesting. The new drug that's not on here is Pristique, which is the actual metabolically active form of Effexor. Now, Strattera is categorized by the World Health Organization and every country except Canada and the United States as a stimulant drug, and therefore a controlled substance, and like Ritalin, therefore needing triplicate prescriptions, etc. United States and Canada are the only countries that don't categorize it as a stimulant drug, and because of that, it really gained a huge market share when it first came out because there was stigma associated with the controlled substance that was Ritalin, and there was the need to go back to the doctor every single month and things like that, and Strattera got under the wire on that because they arbitrarily, in contrast to the rest of the world, decided not to label it as a stimulant when it is very much a stimulant. Now I'm going to talk a little bit here about common drugs that are not taken for mental reasons but can have profound mental effects. And the first of these categories is the Parkinson drugs. Now Parkinson's is well documented to be caused by a definite measured deficiency of dopamine in the brain. Unlike all the various mental diagnoses, where people kind of throw around terms like, oh, my serotonin must not be right, or this or that or the other, nobody is measuring your brain serotonin, and there actually hasn't been any documentation that people who are depressed have any sort of serotonin deficiency. In Parkinson's, there's actually a measured deficiency of dopamine in the brain and an atrophy, a wasting away of the cells that are supposed to produce dopamine. And it really serves as the model of brain chemical derangement on which the theories of mental illness are founded. Unfortunately, those mental illness theories remain theories and are not proven as Parkinson's is proven. Well, all drugs for Parkinson's cause psychiatric symptoms. And as I showed in the earlier slide, you could see the drugs that affect dopamine. Heroin is at the top of the list. So even though these drugs are given for Parkinson's, they do tend to not really duplicate what the body's own natural dopamine is doing. And therefore, they do cause a lot of unintended mental effects. You also see in here the drug Requip, which is prescribed for restless leg syndrome. And you see a couple other drugs that are used for a couple of other conditions, but mostly these are Parkinson drugs. Now, the Alzheimer drugs, while they're not categorized as psychiatric medications, they are obviously given with the intention to treat the mood, emotion, and the behavior. And they all do have mental side effects. In fact, if you actually look at the package inserts for each of these top-selling drugs that are given for Alzheimer's, you will find the exact symptoms of dementia listed as side effects of the drugs. In other words, they tend to cause exactly what they purport to treat. This just gives you an idea of what a double-edged sword we have when we try to monkey with brain chemicals. I always say it's sort of like a gorilla trying to program an iPod. Okay, what we know about brain chemicals is precious little. The unfortunate thing about these drugs is that they only work to a very light extent in people who have mild symptoms, and then in only about 1/3 of those people. So, and again, you know, you take all those qualifiers, it adds up to a very, very small percent of people, and there's many doctors who feel that the side effect profile doesn't really warrant the risks. You know, that the potential benefits are so small and almost non-existent for the majority of patients that it really doesn't, you know, warrant the risk of things like personality changes, violent behavior, worsening of dementia. Now, drugs that are given for seizures, of course, are trying to alter brain chemistry intentionally in order to decrease the tendency towards seizures, but these drugs have now moved over into treating nerve pain. What causes nerve pain? We have no blessed idea. However, these drugs did get FDA approval for treating nerve pain in certain select conditions. Lyrica's approval by the FDA was held up for quite some time because it has the potential actually to be somewhat addictive. But it got through the FDA with just a little warning on the label rather than being identified as a controlled substance. And these drugs have very severe potential psychiatric side effects. The stomach drugs also commonly cause mental effects, and that's because serotonin and dopamine, two of the brain messenger chemicals I mentioned, are also found in the gut lining. And so these drugs are given with the intention to alter those receptors in the gut. You could see here thorazine. That was one of our earliest phenothiazine drugs approved back in 1954 for use in schizophrenics, and it's used as an anti-nausea drug. Phenergan is given for people with nausea and cancer nausea from cancer drugs, same as compazine. Reglan is often given to diabetics to control their stomach problems. And here you even see the purple pill, Nexium. And these drugs all have the potential to cause psychiatric effects because they're affecting dopamine and serotonin in the gut lining. And the drug doesn't make a difference between the gut and the brain. It doesn't know it's only supposed to stay in the gut. These pass the blood-brain barrier. Cardiovascular drugs have a somewhat different mechanism of action of causing unintended psychiatric effects. Some of the drugs, such as Aldomet and Catapres, actually affect alpha receptors in the brain. These same receptors are found on the blood vessels. And so while the intention is to treat the blood vessel receptor, it does cross the blood-brain barrier and have unintended effects there. Now the statins at the bottom of the slide there have a whole different mechanism of action. Cholesterol, as it turns out, is the most prevalent carbon-containing molecule in the brain. And for chemistry buffs out there, we know that carbon-containing molecules are called organic molecules. It's the most prevalent organic molecule in the brain. Cholesterol is such a big molecule that it can't pass from the bloodstream into the brain. So the brain makes all of its own cholesterol. One of the functions of cholesterol in the brain is to line the nerves themselves in order to speed the transmission of electrical impulses. So when you strip the cholesterol from the brain, you have the potential of leaving those nerves exposed and maybe not transmitting the impulses as quick. So we find that some of the statins are of a molecule size. They are small enough to cross into the brain. So while cholesterol itself can't cross into the brain has to make it all its own. The cholesterol-lowering drugs, most of them can actually cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain. Well, what are the effects of lowering the cholesterol? There's been some interesting studies. One study seemed to show that because these drugs have somewhat of an anti-inflammatory effect, they may hold off the progression to dementia. But when they followed the patients out another couple of years, they found that, oh, guess what? They actually may cause premature dementia. So they just haven't been followed long enough with the intention to look at that side effect long enough to really see what the effect there is, but it's definitely biologically plausible that stripping the brain of its cholesterol could be very detrimental. The reason this is hard to study is people who take Lipitor are usually people who have some sort of vascular disease. So if that same patient starts to develop some dementia, why it's attributed to, well, he must be having vascular disease in his brain.
So they don't trace it back to the cholesterol medication they're taking?
There's starting to be more attention to this, but in general in the past they have not. Now, smoking cessation drugs are very interesting because there are nicotine receptors throughout the body, including on brain nerve cells. The idea of the quit smoking drugs is to affect these nicotine receptors so the person doesn't have the urge anymore. You know, unfortunately, like I said, the gorilla trying to program the iPod, we know very little about what we are doing when we start to monkey with brain chemicals. And this is just a list of some of the side effects that are listed on the package insert for the popular Chantix, one of the top-selling quit smoking drugs these days. So it's kind of like, okay, it's not good for you, but people have become psychotic, changed personality, and suicide in as little as 2 days on the drug. Now, antiviral agents are also not uncommonly having psychiatric side effects, and the most classic of these is amantadine. And the problem about giving this drug to, for instance, people in nursing homes to prevent the spread of flu is a good percent of them, 20% or more, are likely to have psychotic nightmares. And so maybe you don't have the flu, but you've got a nursing home full of people bouncing off the walls all of a sudden from the anti-flu remedy. Tamiflu is interesting because this is a drug that is given not only to treat the flu, but to prevent it. And the CDC just came out in January with the notice that 99% of flu strains going around in this year, 2009, are resistant to Tamiflu. Nonetheless, it's still very widely used. Children are especially sensitive to Tamiflu. It's been more widely used in Japan than any other country, so the initial reports on the psychiatric effects have come out of Japan, where we found so many children changing behavior, becoming aggressive and violent and suicidal on this drug. Now, the company, the maker of Tamiflu, Roche, the closest that they would come to admitting that there was some suicidal tendency was to say that, well, yes, it's true that some children who were on Tamiflu, you know, if they were, you know, in a building, you know, tall building and next to the window, why they might fall out. I mean, really gross lack of responsibility. There is now a requirement that there's a warning for the mental effects, particularly for children, but there have been plenty of reports of adults having mental effects from Tamiflu as well.
Do you have is there any research that shows exactly how that happens, how the Tamiflu affects the brain cells?
No, I don't know of any. I haven't actually looked for it specifically, but just looking at the biological plausibility, David, the explanations that I have seen is that, of course, a virus is just a little slip of genetic material, either DNA or RNA. And obviously it has a lot in common with our own genetic material. And so it just doesn't seem to be a far stretch that you give something that's antiviral. It's just so inherently anti-life, you know what I'm saying? Right. That you can see that it just doesn't, it's not a far stretch that although it's intended to affect the virus, we have a lot of those same components in our own systems. You see here AZT, which is an AIDS drug, then the herpes drugs, and then another flu remedy. This is just a headline that was talking about when the reports started to come out regarding the hallucination, self-harm, delirium, suicidal thoughts for Tamiflu. Now, some antibiotics as well can cause psychiatric effects, and the most notorious of these is the so-called floxin drugs. They're called quinolones, ciprofloxacin, and other brand names. And sometimes these drugs can have profound effects that do not go away once the drug is stopped. This really needs to be known because otherwise it gets mislabeled as a unique mental illness when in fact it's a drug effect. The anti-malarial drugs, like I said, they're basically the phenothiazines. Those can cause mental effects. Even penicillin in extremely high doses in some sensitive individuals can cause mental effects. Antifungals have been known to cause psychosis as well. I was asked to give some drug talks in the local high school a few years ago because kids were taking cough syrups and taking their marijuana cigarettes and dipping them in the cough syrup, and this was actually giving an LSD-like effect to smoking a joint. And the active ingredient of the cough syrup was DMX. Now these cough syrups are only available from the pharmacist, even though they're not prescription items. But it does give an LSD-like effect, that combination. Antihistamines mostly can make you sleepy, usually don't cause much more than that, but in some people can be quite profound, and they can continue to seem to operate, and they're really in a drug fog. Requip, the restless leg drug, has a warning against compulsive gambling and compulsive sex behavior. Marinol, of course, is medical marijuana, and interferon is another antiviral that has very prominent mental effects. In fact, people who are getting ready to take interferon often will get a psychiatric evaluation to make sure that they don't have any mental condition that could be aggravated by taking the interferon. Narcotics, of course, and steroids, we've all heard of roid rage. Accutane actually has an effect on serotonin receptors and has actually been known to cause suicide. So I'm going to go into the unique drug effects that are psychiatric. You'll see on many package inserts this term akathisia. This is a totally drug-induced inner tension that gives a person tremendous anxiety, and it's mirrored by an actual motor restlessness. So not only do they feel completely anxious and restless spiritually or mentally, this is mirrored by an actual need to move the legs and to move around and to be sort of in an agitated state of motor activity. Akathisia literally means can't sit still. And this mental and physical agitation can actually progress to panic and violence.
Which drugs are most notoriously associated with this?
The most notorious drugs are the neuroleptic drugs, the major tranquilizers that are now given these days for bipolar. But actually they're on every single package insert of every single drug that's given for a mental condition. This is a vintage ad, again, from a doctor's medical journal talking about the side effect of akathisia. And it says here, life has been pretty tough, even with the help of tranquilizers. But they're making him shift his legs constantly and twist his fingers and smack his tongue. So they're advertising the remedy for the akathisia that the major tranquilizer caused. And the other thing that these drugs can cause, there's a spectrum of movement disorders that starts with akathisia and tremors and can go into full-blown drug-induced Parkinson's. So here we have a drug that's being prescribed to treat the drug-induced Parkinson's. I'm going to go into some case reports here. This is a picture of Chris Benoit. You may remember him back in 2007. He was found hanging from the hoards of his exercise equipment, having committed suicide after strangling his wife and 7-year-old son under the effect of anabolic steroids, hydrocodone, and Xanax, all 3 of them psychoactive. In fact, his doctor was under federal indictment at the time for a whole different drug scam. And he was giving this guy enough anabolic steroids per week that would have lasted a normal person something like 10 months.
Oh my God.
The medical examiner actually took the unusual step of doing an autopsy on his brain and found 10 times the normal concentration of testosterone there. And although this guy was, one of these TV wrestler guys, he was always known as sort of a gentle giant outside of the ring, never in trouble with the law, never had any violent scuffle in a bar or anything like that, a real family man. So this was actually a case of drug-induced psychosis. And, of course, the World Wrestling Foundation said, oh, well, he had head trauma from his wrestling.
So they denied it. Because most wrestlers use these steroids anyway.
Yeah, exactly. This is a picture of Alan Woolley. He was a chemistry professor in England, and he was on Zocor, which is a cholesterol-lowering drug, which gave him profound psychiatric symptoms. And even though he had no prior history of mental illness, he ended up attaching a note to himself that said something like, just take my wretched body, and he walked onto the train tracks and let himself get run over. And the remarkable thing about this is the courts in England ruled this as an involuntary intoxication case based on Zocor. This is a picture of Misty Mina Hassan. She was a person who was being treated for depression with Effexor and Klonopin in Berkeley, California. And she looks pretty dark here. This was after she was apprehended. But she read the package insert for Klonopin and found out how toxic it could be and proceeded to give it to her 5-year-old son and kill him. And this is somebody who had no history of child abuse, no psychotic behavior or anything. She was distraught over the breakup with her boyfriend and, was under the effect of Effexor, which carries a homicidal warning. This is a picture of Cho of Virginia Tech fame, and his exact drugs are unknown. His medical records have not been made available to the general public. But what is known is he had several prescription drugs, psychiatric drugs, among his effects. And also his roommate told the story about how every morning he would line up all these bottles and have this ritual of taking all these pills. So we know that he was not only on a psychiatric drug, but probably there was polypharmacy going on. He was on multiple different drugs, who knows what. This is a picture of Stephen Kay. Don't make me say his last name. This was the Northern Illinois University shooter back in February of 2008. And was an honor student in criminology and was a quiet guy but very well respected, working with other students and professors throughout his career as a student there. And he had, again, was going through some kind of emotional upset regarding some issue with a girlfriend, and he had recently been on antidepressants. And all these histories that I'm showing you, these are people who had no prior history of psychotic or violent behavior, and they were all being treated, among these ones with the mental ones, for sort of very minor life issues. In other words, these weren't, like the severely institutionalized people. This is a picture of Christopher Pittman. You see him here when he was only 10 years old with his grandfather. He lived with his grandparents, and when he was 12, he was just having some shyness in school. And so the doctor convinced the grandparents that Christopher needed to go on Zoloft, which was not tested or approved for use in children, but is unfortunately used widely in that population still. And then they increased his dose after just 1 week, And he was basically taking an adult dose. At 12 years old, he was 95 pounds and 5 feet 1 inches tall. I just know all these details because I reviewed his medical record. And in the middle of the night, he got up, no violent history whatsoever, shot his grandmother and grandfather, and then set the house afire, and got in the family car and drove away. And he was apprehended a couple blocks later by the cops, and he said, "I think something happened to Grandpa." And what's very, very common over and over again we find with these cases of drug-induced psychotic violent behavior is that the person has what's called depersonalization, again, something that's listed right on the package insert. And this is basically a sense that you're not yourself and you're not carrying out these activities. It's as if you're watching a movie. And Christopher Pittman's testimony says, "It was like a movie that I couldn't stop." And we hear almost this exact same words over and over again from these people that carry out these drug-induced murders in a setting of drug intoxication. He was held until he was 16 years old. He was tried as an adult, and he's serving life in prison right now. This is a picture of the Columbine killers. We don't know anything about Eric Harris. I'm sorry, about Dylan Klebold, but Eric Harris was on Luvox, and Luvox was one of the earliest antidepressant drugs that was notorious for provoking suicide and homicidal behaviors and very violent behaviors. It was the first one to get such a warning. Now, of course, all of the antidepressants carry a black box warning for suicidality and aggression and things like that up to the age of 26. Of course, we know that there's really no difference in the brain of a 26-year-old and a 27-year-old, but that's as far as the studies go. This is a picture of Asa Kuhn. Some of you may recognize him. He was in School of Rock with Jack Black. Indeed, he was a protege of Jack Black, and you can see him kind of looking like Jack here. And he was a student at a high school in Ohio, and he was under court-ordered treatment. He had a real disruptive family life, however, never had any violent behaviors. He was court-ordered to take trazodone and clonidine, and his publicly available medical records quote him saying over and over again, "I do not like the way these drugs make me feel. I do not feel like myself. I feel afraid on these drugs. I feel like something's going to happen." And one day he inexplicably went to his high school and shot 2 teachers and 2 students and then killed himself. Luckily, the others did survive. This is a picture of Jeff Reardon here in his Red Sox uniform, but he was actually known for taking the Minnesota Twins to the World Series in the late 80s as a relief pitcher. A religious family man who had no mental illness history. His adult son actually died of a methadone overdose, and this, of course, plunged him into an understandable reactive depression. So they started piling on the psych drugs, and what they would do is give him one drug, which gave him a side effect, so they'd give another drug to treat the side effect of the drug instead of recognizing that it was a drug side effect. And in this way, he was on multiple psychiatric drugs. And then he had some cardiac issues and ended up on a couple of heart medications, which, as you saw on the list earlier, could have potentially contributed to emotional instability. Well, it comes around about exactly a year, the anniversary of his son's death, and on that day he was sent to the mall by his wife to go buy a coffee maker. And to hear him tell it, he says he found himself back out in the parking lot standing by his car with a paper bag full of cash. And he says, "I knew something was wrong." Had no memory for how he got this cash. He ended up tracking down a security guard of the mall and said, "I think I did something bad." Come to find out, he had robbed a jewelry store for cash. He had 600 of his own dollars in his pocket. Again, no memory for the, vague memory for the events, a sense of depersonalization. It wasn't really me. There was a movie. I couldn't stop it. Exactly the same thing. The sad thing about his story is they decided he was, quote, allergic to all mental drugs, and instead they electroshocked him. And at this point, he can barely remember his son's name.
Oh my! Oh my! Now, what drug was it again that he was on?
He was on a real mixture. He was on multiple antidepressants and a couple of cardiac drugs.
Okay.
This is a picture of a Dr. Chiu, a family practice doctor from the Nashville area, who was on Effexor, and I'm just sort of picking on Effexor here just to make a point. It's one that does have a warning regarding causing the person to be homicidal. He was at some sort of a conference in Washington, and when he went to the airport to fly back to Nashville, he realized he had gotten there too late and the gate was closed, and so he got the bright idea under the effect of Effexor to call in a bomb threat. Oh, that'll keep the plane on the ground. Well, of course, he did this on a public phone, and he was overheard, and he was reported. He called in 3 times. And the scary thing is they released him on his own recognizance pending his trial, and they just said, you just can't take planes, so this guy's loose on the highways. That's kind of scary. Now, what he said was, oh, I must have missed a dose, which biologically is not really a plausible excuse because Effexor has a very long half-life, and missing a dose or 2 or 3 shouldn't make a difference. Although with all these drugs, there is the potential for serious withdrawal effects where psychosis can be precipitated, even if the person was not psychotic before they were on the drug. So I'm not sure whatever happened to his case, but all we were able to get was a court drawing when he had his hearing. This is a sad story. These are the daughters of Alicia Green, and these are 3 girls who lived in Haltom City, north of Dallas. And these girls were pulled into a closet by their mother. She was taking antidepressants, an antipsychotic drug, a so-called mood stabilizer, and an anti-anxiety drug. And she doused herself and these 3 beautiful girls with gasoline and lit a match. And the middle girl actually ran out, got to a neighbor, and the girls, you know, everybody was rescued. When this happened, we were scheduled to give this presentation at the Dallas coroner's office. And this happened a week before we went up there. And the day we gave this presentation in the coroner's office, the little 3-year-old succumbed to her burns, and her body was brought into that morgue. Now, you could see from the drugs that her mother was on, she started off with some little marital discord. She was put on an antidepressant. That made her a little psycho, so they put her on an antipsychotic, which is the major tranquilizer neuroleptic drugs I talked about, you know, and that made her, you know, have mood instability, so they put her on a so-called mood stabilizer, which is one of those seizure medicines we saw, and that, of course, gave her anxiety, so they pile on an anti-anxiety drug, and this is how polypharmacy grows. And when you look at the potential adverse effects of these drugs individually and then mix them all together, you're really having a loaded gun there where anything could happen.
Right.
Well, this is a picture of the famous Yates family. And you may remember this was the woman who had been a nurse, an oncology nurse as a matter of fact, never had any violent history whatsoever, and was diagnosed by her husband, according to a checklist that he assessed, with having postpartum depression. And as often happens with mental issues, you can just go to the doctor and say, well, I saw it on the internet, or I saw it on TV, or my cousin said, or whatever, and I think I have these symptoms. Can we have a drug? And I ask you to take a look at this picture. And if you didn't know that Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children, they don't show the baby in this picture, who would you think would be the crazy one in this family?
The husband.
Yeah, Rusty's looking a little intense there, huh?
Right.
But anyway, she was actually on Haldol, which is an antipsychotic drug, even though she had no psychosis, no diagnosis of schizophrenia. And then her psychiatrist, by the way, her medical records are available on the internet. Her psychiatrist documented that she was becoming psychotic on the Haldol, so he stopped the drug cold turkey. Not recommended, almost guaranteed to precipitate a psychosis. So she was already getting psychotic on the drug, a listed side effect, and then he stopped it cold turkey. And he had her on Effexor. Then he went and doubled the dose of Effexor. Again, this is the one that carries a homicidal warning. And it was under these conditions that she went and patiently drowned each of her 5 children, lined them up in bed under the covers, and then called 911. I did something bad. Again, depersonalization. It was like a movie. I couldn't stop it. almost word for word what the others with drug intoxication have been saying.
Oh.
Now, I just want to focus in on Effexor just as an example. And again, most of what I say here, in fact, everything that I say can also hold for the new drug put out by the same company called Pristique, because Pristique is just the metabolite of Effexor, the biologically active form of Effexor. And you'll find in 6-point font on one of the last pages of the more than 50-page package insert, this little warning here, homicidal ideation, causes homicidal ideation. Now, it's a rare or infrequent adverse effect, but when an infrequent effect can be deadly, the patient really has the right to know and to be warned, and the patient's family to be warned that, look, this could happen, specifically so that it's not just attributed to more mental illness. So frequently it causes irritability, insomnia, nervousness, derealization. That's like nothing is real. Depersonalization. I'm not myself. It's not happening to me. I'm not doing this. Nightmares. But homicidal ideation. That warning went on there, by the way, 2 years after Andrea Yates killed her children. This is just a collection of some headlines I've collected throughout the years. What all of these have in common is they were Effexor cases. The other thing they have in common, these people were committing violent acts who had no prior history of violence whatsoever. And the, quote, mental illness that was being treated was mild life adjustment disorders, so to speak, okay? I don't know if you remember the New York City firebombing. That was the first Effexor case that made the news. Here's some more sampling of headlines of violent effects while on Effexor. And some more. I actually spoke with the wife of Mr. Lubrecht, who you see referred to in the bottom headline there. He was despondent because he was unemployed, had lost his job in a cutback, was staying home watching the infant son, adored his child, never would do anything to hurt him. And under the effect of Effexor went and drowned him and is now serving a life sentence in prison.
Now, Effexor is generally prescribed to who? What would be a typical case a doctor would give it Effexor for?
People give it mostly for depression, but it was also commonly given for hot flashes, which is an off-label use, and for bipolar, another off-label use. So off-label simply means the FDA has not approved it for either that age group or that diagnosis or that gender. But the doctors are still allowed to prescribe it. It just means that the FDA has never passed safety or effectiveness tests for it. But the new drug Pristique is widely being given for menopause symptoms and has the exact same adverse effects of Effexor because it's only the active metabolite of Effexor. But Effexor has now gone generic, so they had to come out with the new drug.
Right.
So what we found out is that Effexor can give you a positive urine drug screen for the street drug PCP. Now, anybody who's worked in an emergency room knows that PCP is one of the most wild card drugs out there. A person can be sitting there very calm one second, the next second they've picked up the exam table and they're hauling it, and throwing it against the nurse's station there. I mean, this is a drug that is so unpredictable. Well, it turns out Effexor can give you a positive urine screen for PCP. So I took a look at these drugs, and the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration website says the reason that happens, they think, is because the Effexor molecule looks so much like the PCP molecule. And we find that these drugs affect a lot of the same neurotransmitters in the brain. When we look at what the Drug Enforcement Administration says about PCP and compare that to what the FDA requires the manufacturer of Effexor to put on their label, we find that they can both cause sedation, drowsiness, stupor, which is sort of an awake state of sleepiness, lethargy, even coma. Then we look at their stimulant effects. Now, drugs that cause both sedation and stimulation are very, very dangerous drugs because you never know in any one person how they're going to respond, and they can have a sedative effect 1 minute and it can flip over into the stimulant effect the next second. So they cause increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, sweating, dizziness, all these speeding up things, weight loss, diarrhea, anxiety, agitation, tremor, and here you see that word akathisia, which is the inner and outer restlessness that can progress to violence and agitate and panic. Now take a look at the altered behaviors. The left side of the screen is the sum total of all the altered behaviors listed on the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration website for PCP. But effects are, look at that list, including homicidal ideation, dementia, paranoid, psychotic, hallucinations, hostility, manic, agitation, disordered thinking, and of course depersonalization. I find this very impressive. And so it started to come out in 2005 and 2006 how much the antidepressants were linked to violence. Only it's not considered a rare effect anymore. Of course, it has been said that the difference between homicide and suicide is simply what direction the gun is pointed. And all of these drugs, all antidepressants, currently carry a black box warning regarding suicide, indicating that there's up to twice the risk of suicidal attempts, suicide behavior, and potentially successful suicides, all the way from kids up to age 26, for all of the antidepressants, even in people who were not depressed or suicidal before they took the drug. So this is truly a drug effect. And when you consider that when you see these big shootings, these school shootings, these cafeteria shootings, these church shootings, it's almost always a homicide-suicide. And really the difference is simply the direction that the gun is pointed. Now, the big category of people getting psychiatric drugs these days are young people who are given this diagnosis called bipolar. Now, bipolar means, you sort of dragging in the morning, and you feel a little better after breakfast, and then you kind of slump again after lunch, and then you feel good when you get off of work. Now, we would recognize this as normal life. But these days, if you go on the internet and you take a bipolar symptom checklist, you or I or anybody we know, my cat, could be diagnosed with bipolar. So again, there's no objective measurement here. It's simply subjective. In fact, in Europe, bipolar is not even recognized as a diagnosis in people under age 18 because they call that childhood. But here we have even 2-year-olds being diagnosed with bipolar. There was a study done by Columbia University, and this is a graph I reproduced from the New York Times article reporting on it, talking about the increase in the popularity of the diagnosis of bipolar for people 20 and under. It's gone up 4,000% in a 9-year period. Now, if diabetes went up 4,000%, or blindness, or pneumonia, I mean, we would just have a national disaster, but instead, what we have with bipolar is huge profits being made. You could see these neuroleptic drugs, again, the nerve seizing, what I call the chemical straitjackets, starting off with the newer generation of them being introduced in the early 90s, and then more and more and more started to come out, and it is a $10 billion a year industry. Senator Grassley's committee has been investigating the popularity of the bipolar diagnosis simply because of this 4,000% increase in these profits made. And in connection with that, he has cross-examined Joseph Biederman, who's the head of child psychiatry at Harvard University, and found out that Dr. Biederman has been in the pay to the tune of more than $1 million of drug maker Johnson & Johnson, whose biggest selling drugs are in this category. And that the whole idea, they've actually gotten internal documents from Johnson & Johnson showing that Biederman was actually paid in order to popularize this diagnosis. And this is what's provoking the conflict of interest legislation that you see going through Congress right now. So these drugs are just, really being prescribed like crazy. And this headline from the St. Pete Times says, is it safe? Nobody knows. Well, in fact, we do know that these are the drugs that cause movement disorders, including Parkinson's. And we see now more kids on anti-Parkinson drugs than we've ever seen before. And the sad part of this is that once these drugs have been on board for 2 years or more, it's very, very difficult to ever remove them from these drugs. Just like you cannot take a Parkinson patient off of his dopamine, you can't take somebody who's been on a neuroleptic drug for this long. You can't just pull it away very easily because their body and their brain chemicals have adjusted to that drug as if it were a necessary nutrient. So it's really a crazy thing that's happening with this. I have this slide up here just to remind me to remind you not to shoot the messenger. I'm not saying that all drugs are bad or that these drugs don't have any place in society and that they shouldn't be given, but I am saying that everybody but everybody deserves informed consent. Informed consent is simply being informed as to what your diagnosis is, what it's based on, what the actual drug is, how it works. It may come as a surprise to people that every single drug that's given for mental purposes has in its package insert a little line that says the mechanism of action is not known. It may go on to say it's hypothesized this, it's theorized that, but in fact it's not known. And they have a right to know what's known and not known about the safety of the drug, what's known and not known about the effectiveness, and also what are the viable alternatives to the treatment. This is just a slide talking about my website, smartmedinfo.com, where we specialize in information that your doctor may not know or may not be telling you simply as a supplement to a full informed consent discussion between you and your doctor. Well, that's the end of my formal presentation, David. I'm open to any questions.
Oh, absolutely. This has been so revealing and yet so sad. I mean, I'm here, I'm just grieving here, just thinking about what you've been talking about. I have a note here saying this is a wonderful, in capital letters, webinar. Is it recorded? Will it be repeated? Everyone needs to see and hear this. Thank you, in caps, Dr. Dolan.
Wonderful. Well, the thing is that all I'm explaining here is things that your doctor actually has a moral, ethical, and in most states a legal obligation to disclose to you when such a prescription is offered. And the problem is that people are being diagnosed with mental illness just by checklist or just by mere symptom or simply because they saw a commercial and decided that that might be a good thing for them. And informed consent is not routinely taking place. The majority of what I have shared with you is available simply on the manufacturer's package insert. The rest of it is available on either the FDA website or the Drug Enforcement Administration website. This is not information that is very difficult to dig up.
Yeah, but most people aren't going to read the small print on that that comes with the package.
No, but I tell you, what people can do is they can become empowered as consumers and they can ask their doctor these 8 questions. What's known about how the treatment works? Is it FDA approved for my condition? How does the drug affect the body and mind? What unwanted effects might occur? What's known and not known about the safety of the drug? What's known and not known about how well it works? And what are the alternatives, including the option of no treatment? And finally, what conflicts of interest does the doctor or the clinic have? And these 8 questions, which is what we focus on at smartmedinfo.com, is what we would like consumers to be empowered with, because no, we don't expect them to go to medical school. And by survey, we've actually looked on the internet just very tediously and done the pencil and paper work on it, and we have found that 99% of drug information websites are actually sponsored by somebody who has some money to make by selling you a drug or a medical device. So you basically have to know what questions to ask and get your doctor to answer these questions. If your doctor feels offended by it or challenged by it or doesn't know the answer, time to doctor shop.
Right, right. Now, you have all these 8 questions on your website, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, our website is actually more directed toward employers to get subscriptions to the medical information content of our website for their employees, but we do have some contact information where people can contact us as an individual to find out how to subscribe to the content.
Okay. And if someone, let's say, is on psychiatric drugs, for instance, can they go to your website and let's say they subscribe? Can they go to your website and find whatever topic they want to find out about, the main things, the main risks and benefits? They'll be able to find out there.
Well, what we have is we have what we call fact files, which are drug information sheets that are written in lay language, and they're not meant to cover every single potential side effect, but certainly there are things that your doctor might not know or might not be telling you and can at least be a supplement to the conversation of informed consent. We also have what we call lowdown articles. It sort of gives you the lowdown, again, looking at the controversies when it comes to informed consent for a variety of things, including the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness, use of vaccines, appropriate use of stents, and, the diagnosis of anything from fibromyalgia to restless legs. In other words, we pick topics that really highlight the need for the doctrine of informed consent.
Okay. All right. I'm going to start shooting out some questions. Does thyroxine have any of these effects? I guess you're referring to the psychotropic effects.
Yes, as a matter of fact, thyroid drugs in various forms were one of the earliest drugs that were used to treat what used to be called dysthymia, which we now call depression. Back when thyroid hormone was first discovered. So an excess of thyroid hormone can make you speedy and in fact psychotic. It also occurs naturally if somebody has untreated hyperthyroidism. They can actually become psychotic, and I actually know of one case where a woman ended up in the state mental hospital because of undiagnosed hyperthyroidism. So either too high thyroid or too low thyroid can give you some mental effects. Now, when somebody has a documented deficiency of their own thyroid hormone and they're prescribed thyroxine or some other thyroid supplement, and you're following the blood levels to make sure you're not going too high, that would not be expected to give these effects. But I personally know of a patient who did get profound mental effects on thyroid supplement, even though it was only being given in a normal replacement dose. So yes, it can happen.
Does Dr. Dolan give talks, write books? There we go again. Do other seminars?
Okay, the book is in progress. I actually do give a variety of topics, talks to audiences as diverse as mental health boards, school boards, public defenders, toxicologists, physicians, nurses, social workers, community groups. So yes, I do give talks, and usually I'm giving a presentation along with an associate of mine who's a pharmacist.
So do you have your itinerary?
We can be contacted through the contact page on smartmedinfo.com.
Do you post your itinerary on your website?
I do not.
Oh, it's classified.
Yes, I could do that. Thank you. I'll put that on my to-do list right after the book. Yes, there's a forthcoming book called Smart Medicine, basically describing the principles of informed consent in a variety of areas, not just the area of mental health, but certainly in mental health. The reason I started giving this talk, David, is that when somebody like that chemistry professor from England, when they go nuts and for no reason, people go, oh my God, well, what medicines was he on? However, when someone goes and shoots up a school and they were being treated for depression, people tend to say, oh, well, he was depressed, instead of saying, oh my God, what drugs was he on? And so for this population, it's especially crucial to get informed consent, and not just informed consent for the person who's taking the drug, but for the community at large to know what these drugs are doing, especially when we're giving them out like candy with a 4,000% increase in the bipolar diagnosis, for instance.
Well, I mean, the next question people have is, well, I mean, there are legitimate cases of patients who have severe depression, and drugs like these that we just mentioned are the only things that have helped them out. I mean, what do we say to such people like this?
Again, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be these drugs. What I'm saying is that if somebody is going to be prescribed these drugs, they have to be prescribed them only after they have given informed consent. And these days, people are not being given the opportunity for informed consent, even though it's required by the doctor's own medical society ethics code. It's required by the medical board rules. It's required by national and state guidelines, rules, and regulations. Almost nobody knows of the principles of informed consent. They don't even know that they have a right to it. So I'm basically a libertarian. If somebody wants to give themselves one of these drugs and consent to it, as far as I'm concerned, that's up to them. It only becomes not up to them when it starts to affect public health and safety. And when the drug that you're given can jeopardize my child at school, then all of a sudden it's not okay. And that's why the general public needs to be alerted as to the adverse effects of these drugs. I feel that if people were given full informed consent on what's known and not known about the safety, what's known and not known about the effectiveness of these drugs, that they'd be more likely to initially seek some non-drug alternatives. For instance, nutrition, allergy testing, change in lifestyle, looking around in their environment to find the factors that are basically suppressing them, that type of thing. I have never, ever seen a patient in my practice that either had a chronic pain syndrome or had a mental diagnosis that wasn't also having a major life situation that they were sort of tolerating and being the effect of, that they actually could have changed. I have never seen it. In other words, mental distress does not happen in a vacuum. You are not a bag of chemicals.
Someone wants you to speak talk more about the effects of trazodone.
Okay, well, it's one of the drugs that has some profound sedative effects, has an addictive potential, and can alter mood, emotion, personality, behavior, and thinking. Can keep you from thinking straight, can keep you from being able to operate machinery such as a motor vehicle, can alter your judgment. Simply look at the package insert of it. The trick is to translate the medical mumbo-jumbo into lay language. Again, causes the very adverse effects that it purports to treat. This is one of the things we see with all of these drugs. Now, if somebody is undergoing a medical procedure and they need to be given a sedative, a short-acting sedative, so that they don't jump off the exam table, for instance, that's one thing. But when somebody's given something like trazodone on a daily basis for weeks and months, one, there's addictive potential. Two, there could be, change in behavior. Three, difficulty with cognitive function. And what happens is the adverse effects of the drug start getting labeled as if it's, quote, more mental illness. And then you get a second drug and a third drug. So you take it in order to sleep. You can't quite wake up in the morning. Next thing you know, you're being prescribed an amphetamine.
To give you a pick-me-up, huh?
Yeah, that makes you somewhat agitated and a little psychotic. Next thing you know, they add one of these neuroleptic drugs. That, of course, starts giving you a movement disorder and a tremor, and suddenly your IQ is going down. They start saying you have dementia or your mental illness must be getting worse.
My wife is trying to get off Klonopin, having trouble. Any recommendations?
Klonopin is a benzodiazepine. Can be very, very treacherous to get off of. The person needs to come off very slowly under the guidance of a physician who has experience in drug withdrawal, and along with intense nutritional support.
Absolutely, that's a key point. And folks, Dr. Dolan does recommend nutritional support too. So don't think that this is not all about just drugs alone. But it's very, very important, especially for the brain. And I'm just going to put a plug in for some of our tools. we have a class on the human brain, what the human brain needs to function well, and that includes nutrition, of course, and the other emotional supports. What we know is that if you can support and give your brain, your nervous system, your endocrine system, the key things that they need, and most of us are simply not getting those things from our food. That's just the plain, simple truth. If you are on psychoactive drugs, it would behoove you to also take and seek out these nutritional supplements that will help to protect and give you protect your brain cells and your endocrine system cells. Very, very important. They can help to minimize the side effects that Dr. Dolan has been talking about during this webinar.
Well, one of the sad things about the medical profession is that most of their information comes from the drug manufacturers, and they are in the business of selling drugs. They're not in the business of helping you get off their drugs. So there is a real, there used to be a tremendous lack of information and guidelines on how to wean off of these drugs and what was needed. Now that medical literature is growing, and there are an increasing number of providers that will assist people with this. But unfortunately, you tend to have to go to the very doctor who prescribed the drug to get him to cooperate to give you, lowering and lowering doses, a weaning regimen. Most people find that the best way to go about it is to get with a chiropractor who's experienced in nutrition or a naturopath, if not a so-called orthomolecular psychiatrist who basically works with nutrition in order to get themselves off. The fact of the matter is most people take themselves off on their own, and that is a very, very hard road, and it's hard for the family and associates. I would refer people to a website called theroadback.org. So all one word, theroadback.org. There is also a professional detoxification center that works mostly with prescription medications called Novus, N-O-V-U-S, Novus Detox. And they have a very informative website and newsletter that gives all kinds of information about what types of weaning programs are successful. I'm sure that there's others. That's just one on the West Coast, theroadback.org, and one on the East Coast, Novus Detox, that I know of. Certainly the things that conventional medicine is accustomed to doing is treating drugs with drugs. And so you'll find that most of the withdrawal programs that, for instance, your medical insurance would pay for are simply substituting one drug for another instead of actually making you drug-free and nutritionally healthy.
Right. Well, speaking about nutrition, someone asks, can you suggest natural therapies for such conditions as schizophrenia or bipolar? Is there helpful information source for such natural therapies? I have done considerable research, but would welcome further comments.
Well, the first thing I would say, and where the bulk of the attention should be, is on questioning the diagnosis. I would simply ask you to do a Google search on Senator Grassley and bipolar, and you can read all the articles in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Boston Globe about this whole construct, this fabrication of so-called bipolar. Like I said, it's not even recognized, in people under 20 over in Europe or under 18, and how such a thing could become, the most popular diagnosis of the day when mostly we never even heard of it 20 years ago. So first thing to do would be really to be suspect of the diagnosis itself. Schizophrenia is an interesting one. Did you know that the natural history of schizophrenia in a developing country, a third world country, is that they have a very large percentage of people who just get better on their own? Whereas in this country, it's considered a lifelong illness. Well, what's the difference there? Well, in a place like sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have ready availability of psychiatric drugs. Of course, you look at these neuroleptic drugs, and they actually cause all the symptoms of schizophrenia. So if the person had some mental derangement to begin with, they had a certain potential to get better. They're definitely not going to, quote, get better after being on a neuroleptic drug for 2 years. Because like I said, in my own experience, It's about the 2-year mark where people start to become so dependent on the drug that to come off of it can precipitate an even worse psychosis than they went on it for, and even in people who were never psychotic before. So, you know, the first thing to do is to, one, suspect the diagnosis. All of these mental diagnoses are based on checklists that were basically voted into existence. And the 1987 version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the Diagnostic and Billing Bible of Psychiatry, actually has an introduction by the American Psychiatric Association editors of the manual. And they actually say in there that the boundary between normal health and mental illness is not known. In other words, we're just making this up, folks. But we're making a lot of money at it.
Gosh. We have a few more questions, just a couple more we're going to ask. I mean, they just keep pouring in.
Oh,
also, we have a lot of people just saying just how thanking you for the webinar and how wonderful the information has been. So you got a lot of that. I just didn't want your head to swell too much. That's why I haven't read too many of them yet.
Might get too big for the microphone.
Right. Okay. What category of medication is LDN, and are there similar side effects that were discussed tonight? Thank you.
I am not familiar with that abbreviation. I'm not sure what that's getting at. LDN.
Yeah, I'm heard it myself. But whoever typed this in, go ahead and type in what that means, and I'm going to ask another question. Are you aware, Dr. Dolan, of Wilson's syndrome, and what is your input on this? Isn't that copper thing, copper intoxication?
Yes, Wilson's syndrome is an abnormal way that the liver handles copper, and some people have thought of this as primarily a genetic disorder, but it does appear that there's other people who have entity involved, and this is probably more common than we know. However, it's very easily tested for. In fact, any of the metal toxicities are not that hard to test for and are one of the things that is commonly missed in an evaluation when people are so ready to slap a mental diagnosis on something. But it's definitely one of the things that should be part of a nutritional analysis or dementia workup.
Someone just typed in alternativementalhealth.com, I guess.
That's another very good resource for it itself is a resource that has links to practitioners or will assist you with withdrawal from a medication and nutritional support, and will hook you up with practitioners around the country that are knowledgeable in this. Thank you very much.
Great. I'm going to take just one more off. Rest. Hang on, check. Got a few more. Okay. Okay, some other thank yous for expertise. Thank you so much. We need to get you on the radio. This is Dr. Sami speaking now. He's a chiropractor in Denver. Well, chiropractor is really limited in what he does. He does so many other things. But we need to get you on the radio if you are not already doing shows. Great job on just and such an important subject. Thank you for your expertise.
Well, please do contact me through the website. I do radio shows. I'll be on St. Louis and Kansas City shows next month. I think I have some other things slated for the remainder of the year. But yes, I am available to that, and actually I prefer traveling. So please reach me, and we could schedule something.
Okay, great. Some more thank yous, and we just keep joining us tonight, Dr. Dolan, because the information that you have is so crucial to get out there.
Well, thank you very much for the forum to get the word out, Dr. David, and thank Sherry for all of her behind-the-scenes technical support. And, you know, this is really something, these presentations are something that I do totally independent from subscriptions, my website, et cetera. The word really needs to be gotten out. And like I said, I am available for public speaking because I believe that this is not just an individual issue between patient and doctor. It's really a public safety issue.
Right. Well said. Very well said. All right. Well, folks, you have a good night, and see you Thursday. God bless.